If you grew up watching NFL highlight reels, you've seen the legends the league loves to replay. Championship quarterbacks, perfect heroes, clean storylines, convenient history. But there are other stars, real stars, who don't get packaged the same way. Not because they weren't great, but because their story forces the NFL into a conversation it doesn't want to have. And one name sits right in the middle of that uncomfortable category: Lyle Alzado. Alzado was violent, explosive, famous, and unforgettable on the field. A Super Bowl champion with the Raiders. A face of the sport's most brutal era. The kind of defender opponents didn't just prepare for, they feared. But later, Alzado became something else. He became a warning. And warnings don't sell as well as legends. This is the Raiders star the NFL would rather you remember quietly, or not at all. Before Lyle Alzado became a Raider, he was already building a reputation as one of the most intense defensive linemen in football. Alzado entered the NFL in the early 1970s, and he immediately looked like a player from a different category. Not just strong, not just fast, aggressive in a way that felt personal. Teammates have described him as a man who played with fury, like every snap was an argument. And in an era when defensive football was openly celebrated as intimidation, that fury wasn't hidden. It was rewarded. Alzado became known as a relentless pass rusher and a punishing presence against the run. He earned Pro Bowl selections during his prime years and became one of the league's most recognized defensive linemen before he ever wore silver and black. That detail matters, because it means Alzado wasn't just famous later for controversy. He was legitimately elite in the NFL first. Then came the Raiders. When Alzado arrived in Oakland, it wasn't a random stop, it was a fit. The Raiders weren't trying to be polite. They weren't trying to win quietly. Under Al Davis, the Raiders embraced being the villain in the league's story, and they turned that identity into a competitive advantage. If the league wanted clean, the Raiders gave them chaos, and Lyle Alzado fit that brand perfectly. He played with an edge that matched the Raiders' cultural DNA: intimidation, aggression, no apologies. When he lined up, he didn't just try to beat a tackle, he tried to break the offense's comfort, to make quarterbacks speed up their internal clock, to make linemen hold, to make coordinators shrink their playbook. That's what a true disruptor does. By the early 1980s, Oakland was building toward another championship run, and the Raiders weren't short on personality or toughness. But they needed more than attitude. They needed production. They needed a defense that could close games. Alzado helped bring that. And the peak moment came in the 1983 season, when the Raiders won Super Bowl VIII. That championship matters for Alzado's legacy, because it places him permanently in Raiders history as a Super Bowl winner. Not a good player on a bad team, not a great personality who never won. He won on the biggest stage. So why doesn't the league celebrate him the way it celebrates other Super Bowl-era defenders? Because with Lyle Alzado, the story doesn't stay on the field. Even while he was playing, Alzado had an intensity that made him polarizing. Opponents didn't describe him as just tough, they described him as dangerous. Not in a modern cheap shot debate way, more in the sense that he played like he was always close to the line. And that's the first reason his story is complicated for modern NFL packaging. Because today, the league prefers legends that can be celebrated cleanly. Great play, inspirational quotes, neat endings. Alzado's career belongs to an era the league now tries to explain carefully. An era of heavy hits, heavier bodies, and a culture that rewarded transformation, without asking too many questions about how transformation was achieved. And that's where the real forget part begins. Because Lyle Alzado wasn't just a Raider champion, he later became one of the first major NFL names to publicly admit steroid use and speak about it in a way that made the league uncomfortable. Not as a rumor, not as an anonymous accusation, as a direct confession from a star who had lived inside that culture. That confession did something the NFL has never loved. It pulled the curtain back. At the time Alzado was playing, performance-enhancing drugs were an open secret in pro sports. The difference is that most players didn't say it out loud. Not clearly, not publicly. Not in a way that could become a permanent part of football history. The league could always hide behind deniability, until a player like Alzado stopped cooperating with silence. And that's why his story is different from other Raiders legends. Because it's not just about what he did, it's about what he later said. And before we even get to the illness, the interviews, and the NFL's reaction, you have to understand what makes this story so powerful. Lyle Alzado wasn't a fringe player with a loud opinion. He was a Super Bowl winning Raider, a Pro Bowl level defender, a recognizable NFL star. When a player like that speaks publicly about a dark side of the sport, it threatens the league's preferred version of history. That's why, when people say the NFL wants you to forget Lyle Alzado, it doesn't mean the NFL erased his stats from record books. It means something subtler. His story is rarely centered. His warning is rarely amplified. His name is rarely used as a headline legend, because it forces uncomfortable questions about what the league tolerated, what the culture rewarded, and what the consequences might have been. And the next part of the story is where it becomes truly haunting, because Alzado didn't just confess, he got sick, and what he believed caused that illness became one of the most controversial claims ever made by a major NFL player. Long before Lyle Alzado became a public warning, Lyle Alzado was a football star with a reputation that felt built for prime time. He played with visible rage, he had a recognizable face, he wasn't shy in interviews, and unlike many linemen of his era, Alzado was famous outside the trenches. That fame matters, because when the conversation about steroids finally became unavoidable, Alzado wasn't anonymous. He was one of the few players whose name the public already recognized. Lyle Alzado's NFL career started with the Denver Broncos, who drafted him in 1971. He played in Denver from 1971 to 1978, becoming a major defensive figure and earning 2 Pro Bowl selections there, 1977-1978. Those seasons cemented his identity, an intense, disruptive lineman who could pressure quarterbacks and punish run games. Then he moved to the Cleveland Browns, where he played from 1979 to 1984, making another Pro Bowl in 1980. That stretch proved his impact traveled. Alzado wasn't a one-system defender. He stayed productive across teams. By the mid-1980s, though, something changed. Pro football was changing. Bodies were changing. Strength and size were becoming more extreme. The sport was drifting into a transformation era, where players were bigger, faster, and more physically imposing than the previous decade. And this is where Alzado's story becomes complicated, because the 1970s and 80s were also the decades when performance-enhancing drugs became an open secret in many locker rooms. Not openly discussed on broadcasts, not framed as a league issue, but present enough that players and trainers understood what was happening. In 1984, Alzado left the NFL for the USFL, playing for the Los Angeles Express. That move is important for 2 reasons. It shows how chaotic pro football economics were at the time. Multiple leagues competing for talent. It becomes part of Alzado's later "my body paid a price" narrative, because it reflects a period when players were chasing money, career years, and physical advantage across leagues. Alzado played for the Express in 1984 and 1985, and then returned to the NFL, briefly playing for the Browns again in 1985. By then, he was no longer in his early prime, but his name still carried weight. Then came Oakland. Alzado joined the Los Angeles Raiders and played in 1987 and 1988. By that stage, the Raiders weren't just a team, they were a brand built on edge. And Alzado was an easy fit culturally. Intense, intimidating, headline-ready. But here's the key: even though he was a Raider late in his playing career, he's often remembered as part of the Raiders' violent mystique. Not because Oakland invented that side of him, because the Raiders amplified it. Alzado also became visible outside football. He acted in films and television, becoming one of the more recognizable NFL personalities of that era. And that visibility mattered later, because when he spoke about steroids, his warning reached beyond football fans. The first time Alzado's steroid talk surfaced publicly, it didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like a confession without fear. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, especially after he retired, Alzado became one of the first high-profile NFL players to speak openly about steroid use. He didn't hide behind maybe language, he spoke in first person, and that was rare, because most players, even if they used, understood the unspoken rule: you don't turn the locker room's secrets into headlines. Then, in 1991, the story turned tragic. Lyle Alzado was diagnosed with brain cancer, specifically primary brain lymphoma, often described in media as lymphoma in the brain. His health declined rapidly. He was still young, early 40s, and with the diagnosis came the moment that made him a long-term complication for the league's public narrative. Alzado publicly blamed steroid use for what was happening to his body. This is where accuracy matters. Medical science has never definitively proven that anabolic steroids caused the specific cancer Alzado had. Even at the time, doctors and experts were cautious about drawing a direct cause and effect line, but Alzado believed it. And he said it on television, in interviews, and in print with urgency. He warned younger athletes not to do what he did. He talked about regret. He talked about how steroids changed his behavior and emotions, how they fueled rage and paranoia, how they pushed him into a version of himself that wasn't stable. Whether every detail was medically provable or not, the cultural impact of the message was undeniable. A famous NFL player was dying while telling the world that performance-enhancing drugs were part of the sport's reality. That's the moment where Alzado became inconvenient history. Because leagues can celebrate, championships' toughness highlight hits old-school intimidation, but leagues struggle to celebrate the systems that quietly enable dangerous choices, the long-term consequences, the stars who openly regret what the culture rewarded. And Alzado's warning touched all of those topics. The NFL did have a steroid policy by then. In fact, the league's testing program began in the late 1980s. The NFL's steroid testing program started in 1987 as part of the league's broader approach to performance-enhancing drugs. But testing policies and public narrative are different things. A policy is paperwork. A warning from a dying star is a headline, and headlines create pressure. Alzado died on May 14, 1992, at 43 years old. And after his death, his story didn't disappear completely. His name remained in football history. But it also wasn't centered the way clean legends often are. Alzado became harder to package, harder to place in celebratory montages, harder to use as a simple hero story. Because the minute you bring up Lyle Alzado, you eventually arrive at steroids, regret, and consequence. And that isn't the kind of storyline pro sports leagues love leading with. After Lyle Alzado's diagnosis became public, the story stopped belonging to football. It became part of national culture. Because there is a difference between a player got sick and a player got sick and publicly connected it to the sport's most dangerous open secret. That second version creates pressure. Pressure on the league, pressure on teams, pressure on the way fans understand strength and transformation. And Lyle Alzado did something that almost no league ever wants a legend to do. He made the sport look back at itself. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, performance-enhancing drugs were already a major topic in American sports. Baseball was wrestling with it. Olympic scandals were still in public memory. Strength culture was changing. But football had a unique relationship with it because football is built on size, speed, and violence. You are rewarded for being bigger. You are rewarded for being stronger. You are rewarded for being able to endure collisions. That reward system creates temptation. And when a sport's reward system creates temptation, the sport eventually has to answer what it tolerates. Alzado's public admissions were disruptive because they were personal and emotional, not academic. He didn't speak like a lawyer. He didn't speak like an investigator. He spoke like a man trying to warn others before his time ran out. He talked about regret. He talked about personality changes. He talked about paranoia and rage. He talked about how he believed he had sacrificed his health for a competitive advantage. That kind of message is difficult to counter with policy statements. It doesn't matter how many times a league says, "We're testing." When a dying star says, "This ruined me," the public remembers that. It's also important to understand the media dynamic. The NFL is extremely good at controlling its narrative today. But in that era, the league's media ecosystem wasn't as unified. There weren't social media platforms to flood with controlled messaging. There weren't massive content pipelines like today's NFL network ecosystem. The league didn't have the same centralized storytelling machine. So Alzado's message traveled, and it traveled in a way that could not be easily softened. The league and medical experts often emphasized that there was no definitive scientific proof that anabolic steroids caused Alzado's specific cancer, and medically, that caution is legitimate. But culturally, that caution didn't erase the underlying issue. Alzado had admitted steroid use. He had described its psychological effects. He had become a public example of consequence, and the NFL had to live in that discomfort. Because even if you can't scientifically prove one direct cause, you can't deny the broader truth. The steroid era existed, players used, body sizes exploded, and the league benefited from the spectacle of bigger, faster collisions. That's the uncomfortable implication. This is why Lyle Alzado became hard history, not banned history, not erased from record books, hard to celebrate history. the NFL can celebrate a Hall of Fame career with clean highlights and a neat story arc. But Alzado's story arc ends with warning and regret. That's why he doesn't fit the league's favorite kind of legend packaging. It also intersects directly with the Raiders brand. The Raiders of the Al Davis era were built on intimidation. They were proud of being feared. They embraced villain mythology. Alzado, even though his Raiders stint came late in his career, 1987 to 1988, fits into that wider cultural image, the violent, intimidating defender who represented an era of physical football. But modern football is increasingly shaped by safety narratives, concussion discussions, CTE research, player health emphasis. When safety becomes part of the sport's central public debate, legends of intimidation become harder to celebrate. And Alzado is one of the most complicated intimidation legends because his story isn't just he hit hard. It's he hit hard and later warned about what he believed made him what he was. That is the collision. Football wants to keep the toughness. It wants to keep the myth, but it also has to acknowledge the cost. Alzado forces that acknowledgement, and leagues don't like being forced. Another reason Alzado's name remains less centered is that his legacy is spread across multiple teams. Denver Broncos fans remember him. Cleveland Browns fans remember him. Raiders fans remember him as part of the late-career Raiders identity. He wasn't a single franchise icon the way some legends are. That makes it easier for the NFL to let his story remain fragmented, because fragmentation is a form of forgetting. When a story isn't centered anywhere, it becomes less visible. Yet when historians and former players talk about the steroid era honestly, Alzado's name returns quickly. Because he was one of the first stars to say the quiet part out loud in a way that couldn't be ignored. In that sense, he became a cultural turning point, not necessarily because he created league policy, but because he created public awareness. Public awareness changes the questions fans ask, and once fans start asking different questions, the league is forced to respond differently. In the 1990s, the NFL's approach to performance-enhancing drugs continued to evolve. Testing existed. Policies became more formal. Penalties and enforcement changed over time. But the league's storytelling didn't highlight Alzado as a catalyst. It didn't frame him as the hero who exposed the truth. Because that would require spotlighting the truth itself. And the truth isn't a marketing asset. This is why the phrase, "the NFL wants you to forget," fits. Not because the league denies he existed, not because it deletes his Super Bowl ring from history, but because it rarely builds major celebratory narratives around him. Because when you build a narrative around him, you invite questions about steroid culture, league tolerance, physical transformation pressure, long-term health consequences, the ethics of glorifying intimidation, and those questions are complicated. Lyle Alzado's story is a reminder that not every legend fits neatly into highlight reels. Some legends are warnings, and warnings change the sport in ways that can't be turned into a simple commercial. Lyle Alzado's story isn't hidden because it's unimportant. It stays quiet because it's too important in the wrong way. Because when you tell it honestly, you can't keep it as football entertainment. You have to talk about what football costs. And modern pro sports leagues, especially the NFL, prefer stories that inspire without indicting. Alzado's story inspires and indicts at the same time. That's why it remains uncomfortable. When people say, "the NFL wants you to forget," it's not usually a literal erasure. The NFL didn't delete Alzado's name from history. The NFL didn't pretend he never played. The NFL didn't remove his Raiders championship from the record. The forgetting is subtler. Forgetting looks like not centering him in major league-produced nostalgia content, not making him a core face of legend marketing, letting his story remain fragmented across teams and eras, letting the uncomfortable parts be discussed only in side conversations, not in official celebration. That's how powerful institutions shape memory without lying. They choose what to amplify. They choose what to keep in the background. And the truth is, Lyle Alzado is hard to amplify without opening the door to questions the league doesn't like leading with. Because Alzado wasn't just a defender. He was a public confession. He was a famous man who said steroids were part of his path, and that he believed they contributed to his destruction. Even if medicine cannot definitively prove the exact causal link between anabolic steroids and his specific cancer, the bigger cultural issue remains. He described a culture of enhancement and pressure. He described behavioral changes. He described regret, he described fear, and those descriptions disrupt the league's preferred mythology of pure toughness. Alzado's story also intersects with a modern reality the NFL can't escape: player health. Today, the NFL is forced to address concussions, CTE, long-term neurological damage, and post-career quality of life. The league wants to frame itself as responsible, progressive, and safety-minded. It invests in protocols and messaging. But in order to sell that modern responsibility, it often has to separate itself from the past. And Alzado belongs to that past. An era when bodies grew bigger and rules were looser, and where the league benefited from the spectacle without fully confronting the long-term costs. That's not a comfortable mirror. Another reason Alzado's story matters today is because performance enhancement conversations never truly left. Testing became stricter, policies became formal, suspensions became public. But the question didn't disappear. What pressures exist in a collision sport that rewards size and speed? That question still exists, even if the league has better enforcement. Alzado's confession remains a cultural warning about what happens when competitive pressure meets chemical temptation. It also matters because he wasn't a fringe figure. Alzado was not an anonymous cautionary tale. He was a multi-time Pro Bowl defensive lineman across his career, a widely recognized NFL personality, a Super Bowl champion with the Raiders, Super Bowl EA, after the 1983 season. A man visible enough for his warning to reach mainstream audiences. When a figure that prominence speaks in regret, it becomes a defining story, even if the league tries not to center it. Lyle Alzado died in 1992 at age 43. That's young, and the speed of his decline made his message more haunting. He didn't have decades to soften the story into gentle reflection. He had urgency. He had limited time. That urgency gave his words weight that polished PR messaging can't compete with. It's also worth saying clearly, Lyle Alzado is not remembered only for steroids. He should not be reduced to a single issue. He was an NFL player with real production, real impact, and real football greatness. He played in Denver and Cleveland at a high level. He had a presence that opponents acknowledged. He was part of championship culture. The tragedy is that when you become a warning, people sometimes forget the full person. And in Alzado's case, the warning became larger than the resume. That's why this story is important for Raiders history too. The Raiders franchise is full of legends who represent edge, aggression, intimidation, and a willingness to be disliked. Alzado fits that identity, but his story also reveals the cost of that identity in the enhancement era. It forces Raiders fans, and NFL fans, to wrestle with the truth that some of the sport's most famous old-school toughness eras were intertwined with a culture that wasn't purely natural. That doesn't mean every player used. It doesn't mean every moment was illegitimate. It means the era was complicated, and Alzado became one of the few people willing to say so publicly. So what is the dark truth behind the idea that the NFL wants you to forget him? It's not a conspiracy, it's branding. The NFL is the best sports branding machine in America. Branding depends on clean heroes and clean narratives. Alzado's story isn't clean. It's layered with regret and consequence. So the league doesn't spotlight it. It allows the story to exist, but not to dominate. That's how forgetting works in modern institutions. But if you care about football honestly, you don't only remember the clean legends. You remember the complicated ones too. Because complicated legends teach lessons. Alzado's lesson is uncomfortable but important. Competitive pressure can push people into choices that feel necessary in the moment. Those choices can carry long consequences, and the culture around them matters. Lyle Alzado's story remains one of the clearest examples of a player becoming more than a highlight reel. He became a warning label on an era, and warning labels rarely get turned into celebratory montages. But they still matter. They may matter more than the montages. That's why, even if the league doesn't amplify him, football history can't truly forget him. Because the moment a fan asks, how did the sport get so big, so violent, so obsessed with size and intimidation? Sooner or later, you end up in the same place. You end up with the stories that aren't convenient. You end up with Lyle Alzado,